Good morning, and I'd like to thank you for joining us here once again at the Greenbrier Church online. This week, our local paper, the Anniston Star, reported that the first vaccine for COVID-19 can be given in Alabama as early as mid-December. And with that one line, people began to breathe a little easier. It seems that this long struggle is beginning to come to an end, and we're already beginning to be very hopeful that life will be soon back to normal. Yet the truth is, there are some things that have changed over the past 9 months that will never go back to the way they were. In a recent interview, David Kinnaman, who is the president of the Barna Group, stated that their most conservative estimate is that 1 in 5 churches are going to close. He says the reason is based on the fact that people are recognizing that those relationships that they thought were much deeper with people are actually not as deep as they expected. Without relationships to anchor them to their churches, people find themselves just walking away. I'm sure that you've noticed our culture is becoming increasingly divided and broken. Our community is drowning in the mire of racial tension, physical violence, and political division. And by all accounts, we have more money, more mobility, and more liberties than we have ever had in the history of mankind. And yet, truthfully, our lives are not any better than the generations that have come before us. What we have called progress has actually resulted in us losing the things that matter most. In his first letter to the Corinthian church, the Apostle Paul told the church not to be concerned when the world acts like the world, because, well, that's how the world is supposed to act. But then he warns them and us to be very concerned when the church begins to act like the world. To borrow a phrase Jesus uses earlier in this X-rated sermon, the church seems to have lost her saltiness, which is the reason that Christianity in our culture continues to dwindle. Some have traded holiness for this pursuit to be relevant, only to discover that they're left with a version of the church that's not only unappealing to the culture, even worse, it's unpleasing to God. Now, I don't want to make anybody feel guilty or shame anybody, but we really need to be honest and admit that in large part, many Christians are living lives that look no different from the culture where we live. The real reason that churches are dying is based on the fact that Christians rarely pray. They rarely read their Bibles. They rarely give their time, their talent, and their treasure. They rarely serve the poor. They rarely share their faith. Too many Christians have bought into this lie that having a relationship with other Christians is, well, unimportant. A little later in this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to warn us that we will know a tree by its fruit. And honestly, over the last several years, the fruit on the American tree of Christianity has been less than desirable. I believe it's possible and unfortunately common for a Christian to spend their entire life believing in God without ever attempting anything in life that actually requires them to exercise their faith. It's one thing to read stories about people who took great risks with God. It's something entirely different to taste the sweetness on that kind of a personal level. See, we have this temptation to play it safe, especially in the realm of faith. Even though we've experienced the deep reward that comes from risk-taking faith, we're still pulled towards comfort and certainty. If you were to take a little time to reflect on your history, you would be reminded that there were times in your own life where you've seen God move in astounding ways. And yet, despite God's perfect track record, we all still have these moments in which we're slow to trust Him, slow to step out on faith, and slow to follow His lead. While there are no silver bullets when it comes to spiritual maturity, there are some things that we must do if we want there to be a depth and a warmth to our faith. Jesus is addressing 3 of these practices in the first part of the 6th chapter of Matthew: giving, prayer, and fasting. You might remember that in the Beatitudes, Jesus teaches, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Yet the truth is, we have no idea how to actually hunger for God because our world offers us so much spiritual junk food. We've trained our souls to be satisfied with shallow devotional thoughts and cute-sounding proverbs and phrases. The reason Jesus talks about prayer and fasting in this part of the sermon is because our relationship with Him actually depends on it. Ultimately, the full revelation of God's glory in our community depends on it. There's no way that we're able to have a complete discussion on prayer and fasting in the time we have together this morning. But honestly, for many of us, this is really the first time we've thought about prayer and fasting, much less heard a Bible class or a sermon on the subject. In its simplest definition, fasting is simply refraining from food for a spiritual purpose. And while many of us might have fasted because we're going to have blood work done, or we might have even fasted as a way to lose weight, the fasting that Jesus assumes the disciples are already doing was for a spiritual purpose. Maybe you're like me and the idea of fasting can only be described as misery. There's a reason that bookstores and the top 50 list on Amazon are filled with books that are focused on dating and marriage, parenting and finances. And yet we're hard pressed to find a popular book on fasting. I believe that's because we view fasting as a burden, not a blessing. Fasting stands in bold opposition to everything we're conditioned to do day in and day out. It feels unnatural at best and irreverent and pointless at worst. It seems a bit un-American to suggest that it's beneficial for us to take a break from eating food for the purpose of connecting more deeply with God. And if most of us are honest, not only do we not understand fasting, we really don't want to understand it. In my own life, it's not that I don't understand it, I just don't think about it. Yet, no matter how much we try to distance ourselves from the practice of fasting, Jesus seems to be pretty clear that it's something of great value for his disciples. Fasting is mentioned over 70 times in Scripture. The disciples of God would often submit themselves to times of prayer and fasting. Moses fasted for 40 days before receiving the commandments of God. David fasts for 7 days as he prays for his sick son. Ezra fasts as he mourns for the sins of his community. And Esther fasts as she prays for the safety of her people. Daniel fasts for 21 days as he seeks out clarity on a vision from God. And Jesus spends the first 40 days of his ministry in prayer and fasting. The Apostle Paul fasts after he encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus. The leaders of the church in Antioch fasted before sending out their missionaries. And in Acts 14, the churches in Galatia prayed and fasted as they prepared to appoint new leaders. Now, once we get to today's section of the X-rated sermon, we find Jesus talking about fasting, not because it was something that they might do or it was a good idea, but because it was something that the disciples were already doing. Jesus wants his disciples to understand fasting is not about us somehow getting God's attention. Instead, fasting is about God finally getting all of our attention. There's in the secret places in our lives where God has our undivided attention, and the reward of fasting comes to the surface. Our lives get to see the beauty of God. I'm convinced the revival we desperately desire can only be found through sacrificial prayer, not the casual, half-hearted pray when it's convenient type of prayer. The future that God desires for his children can only be realized when his children become so collectively homesick for heaven that we exchange our time, our comfort, our lives, and even our eating habits for more time in his presence. You see, that's why fasting is so important. Fasting is how the people of God physically acknowledge our spiritual famine. It begins with us admitting that we've not taken full advantage of God's presence in our lives. Our desire to fast will only occur when we honestly admit that our lives fall short of what God offers us, and we got tired of accepting the status quo. Disciples fast because they understand that it's not ultimately about what we're letting go of, but rather who we're allowing to take hold of us. It's a physical show of our spiritual longing, the moment where we surrender this false notion that the created pleasures of the world are somehow an adequate substitute for God. It's our declaration that what we really need can't be found in the garbage of the created world, but that we also are not going to settle for less when God promises us so much more. While fasting might begin with hunger pains for what we've given up, it ends with this deep satisfaction for what we found, a deeper relationship with God. I firmly believe God alone can transform the human heart and resurrect the spiritually dead culture back to life. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a significant role to play. Every generation gets to choose just how deeply we will feast on the promises of God. And like the children of Israel standing on the edge of the promised land, we get to decide if we're going to live as though the land of promise is ours for the taking. The book of Exodus tells the story that one generation heard the promise and shrank back in fear. They forfeited the deep joy God had in store for them and their children. So God raises up another generation that makes the choice to push through the obstacles so that they can enjoy everything God had in store for them. I don't know about you, but I really want to be part of a church family that pushes through. I'm convinced that God is willing to put so much on our tables that our tables will fall to the ground because they fall under the weight of His blessings. But before we can experience the full weight of God's blessings, we have to be willing to come to Him in fasting and prayer. No matter how deeply God's blessed us, there's always more. There's more for the church, more for the culture, but we have to answer two questions. First, are you truly hungry for more? Some of you this morning are hearing what I'm saying about fasting, but really you're satisfied. There's no yearning, there's no desire to have more God in your life. You've gotten to the place in your Christianity that's comfortable and predictable. The thought of doing anything more is not only unattractive, it's agitating. And so you're out. And God allows you the freedom to make that choice. Others of you this morning are tempted to go deeper, but you have this gnawing at your soul that constantly calls for something more, something deeper, but you're afraid. While you believe that God is calling you to come into the deep waters of faith, you're not sure that you can invest the time and the effort into making the necessary changes. Plus, you're not really sure what that would look like. So what you'd rather do is wait, maybe at another time, maybe when things calm down a little bit, then you'll give it a try. But this morning, there are others of you that feel like God's speaking directly to your heart. You're ready to start today. You're ready to take this step in this deeper relationship with God. We all have to make a personal choice because while God has called us to live in a relationship with Him and His children, we still have to decide how deeply do we want to experience the presence of God in our lives. Before we go any farther, we have to take an honest inventory to see where we are. Some of you are not sure where you are this morning, so let me ask you a second question. Let's see if we can find a little more clarity. Today, are you willing to make sacrifices to have a deeper relationship with God? If you've ever tried to make a change in your life, you know that desire alone doesn't bring about the transformation that we want. Almost everybody I know desires to be in better shape, but the desire to be healthy is not the same as actually being healthy. You have to make sacrifices to obtain what you desire. The same is true regarding our life with God. As we make our way to the tables this morning, I want to leave you with the word of Moses as he looked out over a generation trying to decide whether or not they would take the next step into the promises of God. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 8. Look, I'm giving all this land to you. Go in and occupy it. God had already given them the promised land. They just needed to go take it. It's interesting that while God has already done the work, He still invites us to do a small part in order to make it a reality. Jesus echoes the exact same sentiment when He says, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open. In other words, the life that you've always wanted is yours for the taking, but you have to knock, you have to ask, and you have to move forward. There are times in our lives that we have to face the giants in our land, Just as the Israelites were invited to step into the promised land, I believe this morning we're being invited to partner with God in bringing His love to our homes, our neighborhoods, and our communities. To put it simply, I believe that revival is what happens when God gets what God wants right here, right now. I believe a church and a culture revived by the Spirit of God is the promised land. Now we get to decide whether or not we're going to step into it. I want to experience everything God has to offer in this broken world. As followers of Jesus, we don't live under this cloud of uncertainty that plagues the rest of our culture. The Bible is clear that the story of human history is working its way towards a beautiful, triumphant climax at the return of Jesus, a time when men and women from every nation will gather to feast with God face to face. It'll be a time when the grace and the power of Jesus will eradicate all pain, all suffering, all sickness, and all sin. I believe it's time for the people of God to begin living with a clear vision of the way our glorious story will end. But in order for that to happen, we have to take a step forward. We have to fast from the creation so we can get to the place where God has our undivided attention. Now, this morning, as we here at the building spend some time around the table together, we're going to talk about fasting. One of our shepherds is going to talk to us as a church body about what it means to fast. We have some books that we're going to pass out to our members that are here. And to our members that are watching at home, we want to make those books available to you as well, because our plan is that in the month of January, we are going to fast together. We're not going to dictate to you how we expect you to fast or how we want you to fast. We just want you to know that your leaders, your shepherds, and your staff are going to be spending time in the month of January fasting, praying, begging God to come and to be made known in this community and to allow us as a community of believers to model love in the model city. We would love for our members to join us in that fast. We would love for you to join us in a time of prayer and fasting. But we want to take a couple weeks to get there, to get to that point, because we believe that this is something that we must be intentional about, something that we must do on purpose. Because if we truly want the purpose of God to be seen in our community, we need to seek out His will, and we need to understand His love and His forgiveness and His grace. I'm excited about this journey we're about to take. I'm excited about the chance that we have to come to the table and to take the bread and to take the cup and to remember and to reflect and to talk and to think about what God has already done to invite us into a relationship with Him. And I'm really excited to see what God is going to do next. Because thankfully, we serve a God that has not just shown His power and His glory in the past. We serve a God that is still magnifying His own name right now, in the here and now, so that we can experience the wonder and the glory of our Creator. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you spend some time thinking about joining us on this journey. But more importantly, I hope that you know that you are the creation of a God that loves you, that desires for you to have a relationship with Him, and would love to join you as we go out and we experience the presence of God in the here and now. Have a great week. Please know that you're loved, and I pray that you go in peace. I look forward to seeing you very soon.